Hello, everybody. I'm Dave Turner, along with Pat Pickens, and welcome to another edition of Puck Talk with Pickens and Turner. Pat, the playoffs are so close we can smell it. I'm not sure if it's a good smell, but they're coming. A lot to talk about here today. We'll start with an interesting one. I think someone finally saying what a lot of people have tried to say and maybe fallen on deaf ears in the past, but Panthers owner Vinny Viola was not happy at a call that was made in overtime that led to the Montreal Canadiens beating the Florida Panthers from Montreal. Certainly not the first time we've heard of officiating going one way or the other in Montreal. Probably won't be the last. Pat, what's your take on this? Is he saying something that everyone kind of wants to say but doesn't have the chutzpah to say, or is it something that maybe he just angry that they lost and it doesn't hold much credence?
I think both. Maybe Vinny Viola's a New York City guy. He's from Brooklyn, as we would expect. Made his millions and now goes retire in South Florida. But along those same, if you want to follow generalities, Boston Bruins fans and media have been crying about calls the Habs have gotten for decades, and it seems like there's always been that kind of unspoken but sort of belief that the Canadians get calls on their home ice. So, I don't know about the call Saturday night. I watched some of that game, the overtime, and Matt Pacioretty had the game-winning goal. I'm sure, Florida is obviously in a tailspin here of late, although they won Sunday in Ottawa. They haven't played well enough to get in, and I think Vinny Viola is probably feeling the heat a little bit too. Desperate to get the playoff gate, that revenue, into his pocket for the playoffs. But good for him for saying it because like I said, it's been that belief mostly. I mean, there's been a lot of crying out of New England about that, but it's kind of been a widely held belief that. You look at some of the calls that have gone the Canadiens' way through the years. There's obviously the famous too many men on the ice penalty the Bruins had. There was the illegal stick with Marty McSorley in the Stanley Cup Final in '93, and even some things, sketchy, crazy, odd dives or calls that went again or for the Canadiens last year. When you consider, they took out Ben Bishop. No, they didn't. I'm sorry. I got to stop that. We'll go from here. You look at some of the calls that went Montreal's way last year. I know there was a lot of complaining from people out of Boston on the calls that went for Montreal in that second round series. So yeah, I think there's a perception that Montreal gets calls on its home ice, and maybe Vinny Viola is it's only his second year owning the team. And it's one of those things that, he's just probably very frustrated that his team couldn't get 2 points because of that call. And it may have cost them a playoff spot when you look at how tight that playoff race, given that Florida needs to be better than Boston. Florida can't win the tiebreaker with 6 games remaining, the row. They have those 2 head-to-head still, but, Florida needs to finish 1 point ahead of Boston. And if Florida doesn't finish 1 point ahead of Boston, you can point to that 1 point they lost in overtime Saturday night. So it sounds like frustration and it sounds like sour grapes, but there is some merit to that, I think.
Yeah, I kind of look at it both ways. One, I don't like to ever blame officiating because I think that they're just as players make mistakes and coaches make mistakes. It's a very fast game, and officials will make mistakes too, and it'll happen. But
Yeah.
there might be some credence to it. I think at least bringing it up and making it a little birdie, behind someone's head or something like that. Just think about it, because we're getting into the playoffs. We're assuming that Montreal is going to be there for a few rounds this year, of course. Maybe it's good for the entire league that this was just kind of, the seeds were placed in terms of just people thinking about the officiating and how it is in Montreal. Who knows? Maybe
The other thing about that is, if you consider that if Florida does in fact get in, that will That could be a first-round playoff series.
Yes.
And you plant the seeds into the official's head, maybe they're looking for calls the other way if his team gets in. That was the case. Turn the subject slightly with the Rangers. Elaine Vano and some of the guys from the Rangers were complaining about the Rangers not getting any calls. They had 1 power play over 3 games, and they got 5 on Sunday. So you plant the seeds in the league and the officials' heads, and usually you'll get some change there. Maybe if Florida can find its way into the postseason, that'll change maybe that'll change the wins of the calls in that series.
Yeah, I think it's worth talking. And also for the Florida Panthers, considering that they probably at this point are not going to make it, but they've been relevant and we're talking about them.
Yeah,
that's a good thing. And even for Viola, who is second year, get the Panthers talked about. The draft is going to be there this year. They look like they're going to have a team that is going to be, continue to grow over the future. Jaromir Jagr may very well re-sign there.
Yeah.
The Panthers are something worth talking about now, and that's a good thing. And maybe, the saying all press is good press, whether or not it's really something admirable. Look, the Panthers have a long way to go, but it's things like this that will get people to talk about them, and that's never a bad thing.
Never a bad thing. Now, if you turn your focus to the playoff races, there's been, some strange doings happening here of late. You look at the game on Long Island Sunday, in which 6 goals were scored in the first 10 minutes of the first period. That was pretty bizarre. The Red Wings suddenly have a goaltending problem here, Dave, with Mrazek and Howard, and you say it all the time. If you have 2, you have none. We've been talking about the Wings flying below the radar here a little bit, but they could, it isn't likely, but they could fall to wild card status here. What's wrong with Detroit?
It starts and ends with the goaltending. I mean, they certainly have enough scoring. The defense is pretty good there. But, Mrazek comes in the other day, and I think he had a shutout the other day.
Yeah, Tampa.
Yeah, I mean, you shut out Tampa Bay, you should be okay, and then he comes in and just gets absolutely blitzed by the Islanders. Jimmy Howard comes in. He does kind of right the ship a little bit, but, that's got to be one of the most frustrating things is when you're trying to shuffle goaltenders and one of them looks good, and then all of a sudden he goes out and gets bombed the next day. It's like all the progress you've made trying to figure that out becomes a moot point. And I think that they're going to – look, I guess it has to be Jimmy Howard because he certainly has been there in the playoffs before, and he's been big in the playoffs at times. But he has not been good enough, I think, for anyone to have confidence that he can do anything to kind of deal with this Tampa Bay team if they do, in fact, play Tampa Bay.
You mentioned Howard. Howard kept the Wings in that series against Chicago. Almost beat Chicago 2 years ago before the Hawks rebounded from 3-1 down and won the Cup. Howard's numbers this year, 2.43 goals against, 9.11 save percentage. He has 23 losses between the overtime and the regulation. You said it, it's not good enough, and they're trying. The problem is Gustafson's been hurt because Gustafson was pretty good, although he's just always seems to be hurt. That was kind of the story with him in Toronto too. But you get the sense that it's interesting though because you see the teams that are playing well, and you say, well, okay, these guys are gearing up. You say the Rangers are gearing up for the playoffs, and the Lightning have won 6 of 10 despite 2 straight losses. And Montreal's seems to be, and Boston seems to be playing better of late. And Washington got a huge win on the Rangers home ice Sunday. And then you look at the other teams. You look at Detroit not playing well. The Islanders not playing well. The Penguins are not playing well. And you wonder just how important playing well going into the tournament is because we've talked about it off air and other times. Sometimes we talk about the Blackhawks who have not played well lately. And they just are desperate to get in, just get the tournament started, and we'll go from there. And it almost feels like Detroit's in that mold, where they just let's just play the playoffs already. And you wonder, what the result from that is with so many teams kind of in that mode. When you look at, the Islanders basically have had a playoff spot clinched since January. But they're just playing out the string here, but they hadn't won a game on home ice in the month of March until Sunday. So this is, it's really bizarre to me that Pittsburgh, too, despite 2 straight wins, they beat San Jose Sunday night, has been kind of, I mean, they were ravaged by injuries, but there's been a lot of talk about that problem with the coaching, and the Rangers now have lost 2 straight since clinching a playoff spot, and you wonder, Dave, just like how many of these teams are just, well, let's get this regular season over with and get in and go from there.
I agree. I think so even you look at like the more veteran teams.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly the Rangers have been there. They kind of fell off. Even Pittsburgh as well, because I think Pittsburgh, it all comes down to the postseason for them, because we know how many times they've won the division and ran away with it, and then failed in the playoffs. And look, there was an article from, I forgot who wrote it, but it's a pretty reputable place, where they're trying to say trade Sidney Crosby for the Connor McDavid pick. I mean, that's the kind of things that you're seeing starting to trickle out of Pittsburgh, where they need to win a series at least for things not to be possibly blown up again there. And I think that's what it comes down to, is everyone is nervous to just start the playoffs and to try to just, all right, we know we have to win, let's get to it. I don't want to sit there and play the Edmonton Oilers. I want to just get into the dance. I also think, though, that the divisional format of the playoffs makes it a little different.
Yeah.
Look, right now, as the recording of this Monday morning, generally speaking, all of the top seeds are kind of set. So you know who you're going to play if you're in that 2-3 matchup. And it comes to a situation where it's like, well, maybe in years past when you had the 1-8 format, where you could say, oh, well, that third, that 6 seed looks kind of good because the 3 seed, whoever that is, whether it was possibly the Washington Capitals or something, well, I guess it would have been Tampa Bay, but you're looking at that where you kind of know who you're going to be locked into play, and maybe that has to do with it too, where it's like, all right, we know we're in, or we know we're just about to be in, we know who we're going to play. I do think there is a little drop off because of that.
It's interesting because I was covering the Rangers Sunday before their game with Washington, and somebody asked Alain Vigneault about, do they look towards matchups? Do they, given that, or is it too early to start looking at matchups, or do you move ahead? Obviously, the Rangers are in a different case than like Tampa Bay, because Tampa Bay is, it seems almost a sure thing, Tampa Bay is going to be playing Detroit. Those two know each other really well. Barring a huge drop-off from the Islanders, I mean, the Islanders got a huge win Sunday, but barring that, it's going to be them in Pittsburgh, or like a huge finish from the Caps, who suddenly look compelled for that. But the Rangers are in a different boat in that they could be the 1 seed, they could be the 2 seed, they could be Boston, it could be Washington. Obviously, Rangers have playoff history with both of those teams, but they asked Alain Vigneault. Someone asked Alain Vigneault about who, do they start matching up? They start trying to plan those matchups, and the Rangers played the Capitals 3 times to close the year. So if it's Washington, they know each other pretty well. And he said basically no. It's as they get closer to the close of the season, they will start shifting focus to the playoffs, and who the matchup will be. And it's also, he made an interesting point talking about, you pick your poison, like which team do you want to play? Each team is capable of going to that Cup final and winning the Stanley Cup, even out of the Eastern Conference. I mean, you look at where the Rangers were at last year, they were the 2nd seed in the Metro, which, is like that 4 seed last year, and they went to the Cup final all the way. We're right there to the lost 3 overtime games with the Kings. So it seems like, obviously upsets happen every year. But what also was interesting to me is, a bunch of the Rangers were asked about maybe that clinching hangover. They clinched that playoff spot, and they all said they have a lot to play for, although they've been playing desperate teams who have more to play for. You look at, they played Boston Saturday and Washington Sunday. Both teams are basically fighting tooth and nail to get in. Boston got 2 wins Saturday, Sunday, and those 2 wins basically, have them 3 points up now on Ottawa. But the interesting thing to me is, they all talk about, well, they have so much to play for, and they're still trying to play for home ice, and they're still trying to play for that number 1 seed. And I guess the Rangers have as good a shot as anybody, although Anaheim's pulled 4 points up on them, but the Rangers still have 3 in hand for that President's Trophy thing. But, they all talk about having a lot to play for, and yet the effort, and maybe it was because they were tanked. I mean, they've played 6 games in 8 days, which is a lot. But they all talked about having a lot to play for, and yet Washington looked more desperate and more energetic, despite the fact they both were playing the second of back-to-backs.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting looking at that dynamic when you have a team that's clinched against teams that don't. Rangers play at Winnipeg, at Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me there, Pat. Two teams that need to win games.
Yeah.
You have to figure that the intensity and just the will to win is going to be sure. The Rangers, I'm sure, would love to get off of this little mini losing streak that they've been on, but
Yeah.
you can't tell me that Winnipeg and Minnesota, two real good buildings, are not going to be electric for games that they really need. And
Yeah.
then just using the Rangers as an example here, they finished with Ottawa at home and at Capitals. Those games could all of a sudden end up being more important than the ones they're playing now because they might decide who they play based on that.
Mm-hmm.
Look, if they might, who knows? They probably don't want to play Boston. Maybe they let Ottawa beat them on the ninth, or don't come out as hard and hope that Ottawa grabs a couple points or something, or even take it to a shootout and that kind of thing. And then they play Washington, where they might be able to, at least depending upon where they finish and where Washington finishes, decide there. And then that's where it becomes interesting, is that maybe coaches and teams don't have that ability to kind of 6 games out start deciding, well, if we do these things, we're going to play. And then there's some teams that probably just don't care about that, and they say, look, we're going to have to beat the best teams to get it anyway. Not to mention, did the Vancouver Canucks really fear the LA Kings in 2012?
Oh,
don't think
not really.
So to me, it's like you could say you want to play someone, and then you never know. I think there's only so much you can do in terms of positioning yourself. Really, get in, stay healthy, wipe the scoreboard clean, go out there and play a best-of-7 series against whoever you get matched up against.
You think you'd want to be playing pretty well going into that stretch, because you mentioned all the desperate teams the Rangers are playing. They've lost 3 of 4, and their 3 losses, were against L.A., Boston, Washington, 3 teams fighting to get in. Ottawa, obviously, in there fighting to get in as well. But you mentioned Winnipeg and Minnesota, and all of a sudden you look at Winnipeg, Minnesota. If you lose those 2 games, you probably win home and home with Jersey. And then 2 games after that against Ottawa, Washington, you split those. Suddenly you're talking about having lost 6 games out of your last 10 going into the playoffs. That's not exactly the way you want to go in, if that's the case. Especially with Henrik Lundqvist returning, you want to get him winning. You want to get him going. We focus mostly on the East, though, but you mentioned where the Rangers are playing, and the Western Conference playoff race is incredible. Dave, every time we put the Flames in the grave, they somehow find their way out of it, beating the Predators Sunday afternoon in Nashville. Then, we started to anoint the Kings, and then they lost in Minnesota Saturday night. Kings still have a game in hand, but they both play Monday night, with the Kings playing the Blackhawks in Chicago, who are desperate for that. And the Flames also playing on Monday night in a winnable game. Dave, I'll ask you this for the 4,000th time. Who's going to get in?
Wow, you know what? I think it changes by the day, really. I think the other day we both kind of agreed that Calgary was done, and now all of a sudden we should call them the Calgary Phoenix because they've risen from the ashes.
Ah, well done.
Yeah, and that's just been their MO all year. Is that there's no reason why they should be where they are, but they find a way to get it done. Sometimes the saying, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
To me, they just find a way to come up big when it matters. Sure, their possession numbers are terrible, and they lost their best player in Mark Giordano, and goaltending. They don't have the best goaltender in the league in Hiller, and they find a way.
Forwards are crazy young.
Yeah,
Gaudreau and Monahan and all those guys.
But Sean Monahan is becoming a phenomenal player. I've watched a lot of Flames games, and you see him progress every single night. This kid is going to be an absolute stud. But then you look at the Kings.
Gaudreau.
Yes, Gaudreau he's an interesting player because he's always going to be that heart and determination kind of guy. But even we talked the other day, Pat. I know I was texting you the night of the Minnesota LA game, and I said this is a real big benchmark for both teams. Mm-hmm. And I said if Minnesota can pass this test and beat For the Kings, that was a game that they always seem to win, where they have no business going into a hot team's building and winning, and they do it. And
Hmm.
Minnesota handled them, and for that, I think Minnesota is definitely set. They
Yeah.
technically could, not that they will. I don't think they'll pass St. Louis, but they could find themselves at the very least in that 2-3 matchup. Look, if you're St. Louis, do you want anything to do with Minnesota right now?
No, definitely not.
Yeah, I would say no, especially with their penchant for losing first round series, St. Louis. But as far as the Kings go, I don't know. To me, as much as I'd love to say, and we've kind of flip flopped on this so many times this year, they've lost some games that you'd expect them to win, especially after they go and they go out east and they look really good and they look
Hmm.
like they're playing Kings hockey. And now they have to go into Chicago tonight. And if they lose that game and the Flames win, it's a very tough road for them to get back into it.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Calgary's got to go to Dallas. Dallas is playing well lately, but we talked about off air before this that if Calgary beats Dallas and LA loses in regulation to Chicago, I mean, Calgary's almost set, 3 points up on LA. The other thing to watch out there for, and don't sleep on both of them getting in, is Vancouver's only 3 up on LA. Vancouver obviously has a game in hand on Calgary, but if it feels almost like Destiny's going to get Calgary in.
You ready for Vancouver's next 5 games?
Yeah.
Ready for this?
Yep.
At St. Louis, at Nashville, at Chicago, at Winnipeg, home Kings.
Holy hell! Oh my God.
Luck with that.
Yeah, I mean
They might be out, to be honest. I mean, you can make the case that Calgary and LA might be playing that 2-3 series.
It almost feels like Calgary is Destiny's darling here with what they've done. But Calgary, we said it too. Calgary's road stretch was Nashville, Dallas, St. Louis, and then the Alberta game, which Edmonton's a lot harder to play against. By the way, keep in mind that the Kings and Flames play on April 9th.
Yes.
Which could decide. I mean, you look at that Kings stretch where they go Chicago. I mean, these games are going to decide whether they get in or not. It eases up after Chicago today with Edmonton and Colorado, although Colorado's put a little bit better lately. Then they go Vancouver, but the Kings have the most games still left. The Kings they will play 5 games in the next. As of Monday, they'll play 5 games in the next 8 days, and then they'll play Calgary on the 9th. And if you've watched, I think I've watched 2 of the Flames and Kings games, and the Flames have held their own in those games despite obvious and enormous LA shot margins. Look, if you're basing yourself on Kings hockey and seeing what kind of trend the Kings are going, just follow the shot clock. And the Kings are dominating the shot. I mean, you look at Dubnyk was so good Saturday night, and they gave up. It kind of got out of hand late. It was 4-1 Saturday night, but I mean the Niederreiter scored twice for Minnesota, and he's been great lately. And Minnesota is looking like a dangerous team, but it's all because of the goaltending. Because if you go back, 2 months or whatever it was, maybe 2.5 months with Minnesota, I mean, they would have given up 8 goals in that game against LA on Saturday night.
Yeah, really. I mean, it's night and day. I'd love to see what their PDO is since with the entire league since Dubnyk actually stepped into the net for them the first time, because I'm sure they've got to be up there. But yeah, it's just fascinating, and I think strength of schedule will definitely play into it. Because
now, answer me this, Dave. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but you just said Minnesota obviously game in hand on. Chicago has a game in hand. Those 2 are going to play next Tuesday, Minnesota and Chicago. So Chicago Chicago's got a pretty tough stretch of games too, although they do have an automatic win coming Friday at Buffalo. If you're St. Louis and you don't want to play Chicago because of obvious past history or recent history, and Minnesota looks terrifying, if you're St. Louis, which of those teams do you want to play with home ice? I mean, they've had home ice 2 years in a row, taken the 2-0 lead and then blown the series lead back-to-back years. Do you want to make it 3 years in a row with 3 different teams with Minnesota, or do you want to get the Patrick Kane-less Blackhawks? I don't know, because I think the Blackhawks are a tough matchup in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think they might tell you they want to play Chicago because they would love to get past. I'm sure in a perfect world, if you could tell the Blues they were going to win a series, I'm sure they'd love to win it against Chicago.
Hmm.
But let's be honest. I think they want nothing to do with Chicago. I don't care if Patrick Kane, isn't going to be in this series. Minnesota's been hot. I think Minnesota could absolutely beat them, but I still think it's a different situation because Chicago has been there. They've played big time games. They've won big time games en route to a Stanley Cup victories. Minnesota's been good, but they don't have that kind of ability, and they
Yeah.
haven't been in those big games like Chicago has. Look,
Yeah, no, you're looking kind of at two teams with a history of underachieving. Although it feels like Minnesota is growing, as opposed to this being kind of St. Louis's year.
mhm.
But I think I'd rather, if I were St. Louis, I'd rather play Minnesota, just because that seems like a tough matchup for Minnesota, based on. I mean, St. Louis is a tough matchup for a
Yeah.
lot of teams, based on the fact.
But they could get the one seed still. I mean, they have 2 games at hand, and they're 3 points back in Nashville. So they could
Yeah,
certainly. I mean, look, they could get the seed there and end up with Minnesota anyway, or
or
Chicago.
Chicago.
Yeah, or somehow the Kings. I mean, crazier things have happened. So
I don't know. I keep getting this vibe that the Kings are playing with a lot of, pardon the pun with the Flames being there, but the Kings are playing with fire because it seemed, like you said, it seems like that's a very Kings game to win Saturday night. You watched them on that road trip last week, and they were machine-like with the Rangers. They were methodical with the Islanders, but it feels like, I don't know whether there's not much difference between this year and last year, but it just feels like the Kings are playing with fire a little bit too much. It's going to catch up with them. I think it's going to catch up with them in the postseason, just because, like, we both agree, it feels like Vancouver is going to fall out here. Although every time we start saying that, Vancouver rebounds from the ashes. But like I said, I think I'm starting to get the vibe that Calgary is going to get in, just because they haven't fallen off yet, and we're all just waiting for the other shoe. We thought the other shoe was going to be Giordano's injury, and it hasn't been. And you see Derek Engelland start scoring goals, you start feeling like destiny's on your side. But I'm starting to think that Calgary, LA get in, and Vancouver falls out. Although I'm not confident enough to put money on that
I
at the
think the
moment.
4 game road trip for Vancouver is going to be very tough. And then you go home and you play the Kings, who might be even trying to pass them in the division. So to me, to play at St. Louis, at Nashville, at Chicago, at Winnipeg, you have teams that are jockeying for position and are very good. Vancouver, I think, is going to have a very tough run at it here. I wouldn't
Yeah,
be surprised if they end up as a team to be out,
yeah,
to be quite honest.
I agree with that.
But we shall see. It's amazing looking at these races and how close they are. And I know we've talked about this, that the regular season this year wasn't exactly spectacular. It kind of it went. It wasn't bad, but it was a regular season that didn't have a lot of pizzazz. But
It's
I
been
almost feel
marred by some things too.
yes.
I think it's mostly, and this is an interesting fact from my perspective. This is the first full regular season in 2 years. I mean, you look at since three. I mean, if you want to call, this is the first full regular season in three, because last year we obviously had the 2-week Olympic break.
Mhm.
Gave that during the dog days. I mean, that was a huge break for a lot of the guys who got it. And then the year before, obviously, was the sprint and the lockout. So I mean, this is a full schedule over 6 months, or I guess 6.5, or 6 and a couple weeks months. And it's a grind of a season, as opposed to the previous 2 seasons, which were a little bit faster, had a few more breaks in there, had extended periods. So I think it's for third-year pros, those guys have not ever had a season like this. And the mumps marred it early, and there's been a lot of big injuries to some big players. And I've been very down on this regular season. There's been a lot of chalk too from previous years. Not many different faces, not many different names. Kind of this similar matchups. But like you said, the races are fantastic, and this Hamburglar thing has been really cool. And although he's kind of fallen off lately, Florida's emergence and Calgary's emergence, a little bit of and Winnipeg too. has made it interesting. But yeah, no, I've been really down on this regular season. But like you said, it just the races here have been fantastic,
I think
and
that's what's going
we're
to
only
make it
in for
better.
the best of it.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
I think the fact that the regular season has been kind of subpar, in a sense, because you don't have a juggernaut. I don't think, the Rangers have been good. Nashville's been good. Anaheim's been good, but they have their flaws.
And scoring's
Montreal
down.
certainly, yeah, scoring is down, and I think that you're going to see a lot of really, really good playoff series. Tight, overtimes, 2-1 games, and I think that it's so wide open that for the most part you could at least try to give me a case that almost every team out there, maybe except for I don't know if Ottawa or Florida make it or Calgary, Vancouver, but most of the teams that are in it, I think you can make the case that they have a chance to win it, and that's the beauty of it is that as much as we think, all right, Anaheim and Nashville, the two top seeds right now at West, and Montreal Rangers, that should be the final. I don't know if that's even anything close to guaranteed because there's just so many good teams. I mean, Tampa Bay's lurking. Pittsburgh doesn't ever go away. Then you have the interesting thing with St. Louis, where if they can ever get into gear, what they could be, considering the amount of talent on that team. I don't know, Pat. I think we're setting up for a really, really good playoff run here.
The favorite to win the Pacific Division is outside the playoff race right now, and if they don't get in, you would think that I mean, who's coming out of that Pacific Division? If the Kings don't get in, who's coming out of the Pacific Division?
I mean, I guess you have to go Anaheim just because they've been the best team all year in terms of just scoring points. But
you don't trust Anaheim in a first round series of Winnipeg.
I don't, not at all, because I think that the goaltending is still an issue for them. Look, they're only plus 11 goal differential.
I know
we talked about that. They're 7-3 in their last 10. They've won 3 in a row after they got shellacked by the Rangers. But I don't know. To me, I think Anaheim is certainly a good team, but I look at them as a bit of a compiler where they can score and they can control games offensively. But I don't know how they will do with their goaltending and even their defense, which is good but not suffocating against a team that could really work them. The only thing is, though, they're not going to face that. If it's not LA, they're not going to face that team in the second round. They might even play a better team. You could make the case they'll play a better team in the first round than they might even in the second round.
And you look at what's interesting to me, and this, I mean, Bruce Boudreau's playoff history is just, I mean, he hasn't even made the conference finals.
No.
In his career. So you look at that as a backdrop in a story. You talk about Gibson was so good last year in the playoff series against the Kings. And you know, basically since that first game in Pittsburgh of the regular season, it's just been kind of a lost year for him with the struggles he's gone through. And Anderson hasn't been great. It's almost like the two of them are just trying to figure out. Well, the other one wants to take the starting goaltending position, and they've both been injured, so that might have had something to do with it. They both might be still kind of feeling some injuries, but you said it. The Ducks are the top spot. I mean, they're the top spot in the entire league right now, and we don't. I mean, if LA gets in, they're not even the favorite to get past the second round again. And they may not be. I mean, you don't like them in Winnipeg in that hostile building. I mean, there's not really that home ice advantage in Anaheim that there are in other buildings. Like when you look at, the Minnesota, Winnipeg, the home ice has been fantastic, or Chicago or LA, obvious, or the Canadian cities. There's the obvious home ice advantage. But you look at Anaheim. Anaheim lost a Game 7 on home ice 2 years ago, 2 years in a row. Actually, they lost to the Kings last year and then the Red Wings in the first round 2 years ago. So, I mean, even if you get that winner-take-all game on home ice, there's no advantage there for the Ducks. And I like their team, though. From a 1 through 4, from lines 1 through 4, you get the sense that there's a lot of interchangeable parts. And obviously the guys Getzlaf and Kessler down the middle, you don't do much better than that in the entire Western Conference. But, we talk about St. Louis, about how they're desperate to overcome Chicago and overcome LA. And it would almost be a feel-good story, even if it's chalk, for Anaheim to reach the conference final.
Yeah, it would. I almost feel like they're a bit of an underdog. I know it's weird to say that because they have the most points in the entire league right now,
Yeah.
but I just feel like they and Nashville, the two teams that are above 100 points as in the West as we record this, I think if they were both in the conference finals, I think we'd all be shocked.
Yeah, and I don't, and it would be a fun series too when you look at the differing styles between Anaheim and Nashville. I mean,
Yeah, the other
Nashville,
thing about Nashville to consider is if Chicago does fall into that spot there, into the first wild card, they're gonna play up to 7 home games for Chicago. I mean, it's true. I hate to say it, but Chicago and Nashville are two big hub airports. It's really cheap to fly down there. Chicago basically plays home games when they play in Nashville.
Yeah.
So it'd be really interesting. I think it's a great dynamic actually. If Nashville does end up playing Chicago, which could happen.
But then you consider that 3 years ago Nashville had the same situation with Detroit and won the series.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what makes it fascinating. Is maybe that brings out the best in that team. That they they have to prove to everyone that maybe the people wearing yellow belong in the building and not the people wearing red. I don't know, but
it sounds like Nashville's getting a little creative with its tickets, its playoff ticket things. But Blackhawk fans are everywhere. They find their way in the building. Real quick before we move on to the next topic, you wouldn't give Nashville much of a prayer against Minnesota.
I would not. I actually think not even so much an indictment of Nashville, but I just think the way Minnesota is playing, that if you look at what Minnesota, if they had a goaltender like Dubnyk all year, that we'd probably be talking about them right up there in terms of possibly even. I mean, look, they're only 7 points back as it is.
Mm-hmm.
If you have even another couple days of Dubnyk, they could be right up there trying to push for that top position.
And question,
I think Minnesota.
Sorry, go ahead. Finish your point, and then I'll jump in with that.
I think Minnesota is hot at the right time, and the only thing about Nashville is that they've been steady all year. Every time that we've thought they were going to fall off, they've kind of just kept afloat.
Mm-hmm.
And I give them a lot of credit for that, where they've had these power teams in St. Louis and Chicago that should be ahead of them, and they're not.
Yeah, and then real fast, Minnesota got Dubnyk, and ironic. The interesting thing would be the fact that Dubnyk was called upon by Nashville to save their season last year and didn't, and then all of a sudden you get Dubnyk, the hottest goaltender on earth, going. You wonder what people would do there, but also when you consider that Buffalo traded Jonas Enroth to Dallas on trade deadline day, and Devin Dubnyk's been dominant in Minnesota. Do you wonder maybe Minnesota could have done better in the goalie trade? I mean, I know they probably needed that goalie they obviously needed it at the time because everything was going to hell, and then just I mean, Dubnyk's been fantastic, but since he's been in that spot, they needed him then. And Buffalo may not have been willing to part with Enroth at the time, but you have on paper you'd consider Enroth a better goalie, right?
Yeah, I would think so, but that's just not how it ends up.
Yeah.
The other thing though is, remember, Peter Laviolette makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Goes to the Islanders, makes the playoffs. Then 2 years after, with Carolina, wins a cup. Goes to Philadelphia, loses in the finals.
Mm-hmm.
He's a guy who's been able to turn teams around relatively quickly everywhere he's gone and have success in the playoffs. I think you have to put a little bit of stock behind that.
I agree, but I don't think this is Nashville's year. Nashville's building for the future, and it seems like that. But speaking of teams that are building for the future, we had the most fascinating game probably of the regular season happened last week in Buffalo with the Sabres fans cheering the tank, basically embracing the tank finally. The T-shirts have been out with the tank on it and the Sabres logo above it, where Sabres fans and Buffalo fans to embrace the tank. And with Sabres fans cheering Sam Gagne's overtime winning goal in the Coyotes win in Buffalo, it doesn't basically assure the Sabres a top 2 pick yet, because they're going to play Monday night in Arizona. And you wonder if all the Buffalo fans that would invade Arizona ordinarily will be rooting for the Coyotes again. Mike Weber took significant exception to that, called it the lowest point of his career. Dave, why? What are your thoughts on embracing the tank in Buffalo?
I don't like it, but considering the fact that Buffalo has a guaranteed top two finish if they finish last in the
Hmm.
standings, I get it. Your team's bad. The only way to get better, generally speaking, other than just free agents, is to grab a guy in the draft. And for them, they feel that at the very least, they're going to end up with Jack Eichel, if not Connor McDavid.
Yeah.
I understand where the fans come from, and you just hope that it's not coming down from the team itself.
Yeah.
You look at what the Philadelphia 76ers have been doing for years now. They trade away every actual player they have just to try to keep drafting. It's like they're happy to draft at the bottom of the draft until they find the next Michael Jordan or something.
Right. Well, it's
You would
interesting.
hope
Sorry, go ahead.
you would hope that that doesn't happen on a conscious level in the NHL, that teams are actually trying to do things to tank. If the fans are all about it, that's fine. The fans are the fans. They're not the ones who are putting lineups out there and doing things like that. But you would hope that it doesn't ruin the integrity of the game. If you're really trying to lose a game like that against Phoenix, as Buffalo did.
I don't think they're trying to lose. I just, Tim Murray has the sense that the general manager of the Sabres has the sense that they tried going the free agent route and it didn't work, and now they're stockpiling draft picks. Look, they're going to have the Islanders draft pick this year, the first round pick, so they're going to have at least 2 in the first round. And it's interesting. I read a story in the New York Times about Connor McDavid that ran Sunday, or Saturday, Sunday. It might have run in Sunday's paper. And it said, it has this kind of eye-opening quote from Tim Murray. I tweeted it out yesterday, but I'll say it here. It says, speaking of McDavid, I watch him too much, and I think too much about him. I wish I could help myself. From that sense, you get the idea that, this is coming from management, and that Tim Murray is putting all of his chips. I mean, you heard Glenn Sather put all of his chips into the table when he made the Yandel trade, but this is Tim Murray putting all of his chips in to get Connor McDavid here. And I know you said that, and it's true, they'll end up with one half of the McEichel duo there, but it sounds like between the Erie connection with, McDavid being in Erie of the Ontario Hockey League, and, just the market that they have in Buffalo, it just feels like McDavid in Buffalo is perfect. But with that stated, there's a draft lottery for a reason. It basically started with the Penguins tanking to get Mario Lemieux, supposedly, although that obviously has never been confirmed. But, you look at, Buffalo still only has a 20% chance to land that number 1 pick. They have a 100% chance of getting one of 2, but if they're desperate for McDavid, they got to have number 1.
Absolutely, and you know what? Just to make things fun right now, I'm going to bring up that simulator in just a second, and we'll actually try and see what happens with that. But yeah, it's interesting with them because as the draft is going to change next year, that any team can kind of get into the 1, 2, 3 area, where Buffalo could find themselves picking later. But this year, if you finish last, the only pick that's pretty much up for grabs is the number 1 pick.
Yeah.
They at least wanted to protect the integrity of that, which is good because I think everyone deserves a chance. Why should it just have to be a team that finishes down there? So
I mean, LA.
I'm going to run it right now, Pat. Ready?
It's going to be LA, isn't it?
Coyotes.
Yeah. So then
Okay, so then Buffalo would finish second anyway, of course,
yeah.
as they would. It really all they did is flip flop in that case. So
yeah, but I mean it sounds like, based on speaking with people, prospects people, it sounds like if you have a top 10 pick, you will get an impact player. Maybe not next year, but probably 2 years down the road, assuming you don't screw up the pick. But if you look at where each team is, it's an interesting, there's an interesting kind of dynamic building where Buffalo is desperate for McDavid, and Arizona's kind of just desperate to get. I mean, they'll probably get into that 1 or 2 spot. But if Arizona falls to 3, man, they're going to be, we're looking I'm looking at it from the window of, if all things finish equal and Buffalo's last, they'll get McDavid, Arizona will get Eichel, and Edmonton will draft Hanifin 3rd. But if Edmonton gets the number 1 pick, I mean, what if they want to trade to Buffalo? I mean, they could really use Hanifin more than they could use McDavid at this point. And then maybe, if Buffalo doesn't get that pick, but really is desperate to get McDavid, they have some assets to trade. Obviously not in the NHL system right now, but between picks and between prospects, I mean, and if you look at McDavid in Buffalo, I mean that team's going to be really fun to watch in the coming years. Basically, maybe even next year when you look at Sam Reinhart was their number one draft pick last year. He finished tied with McDavid for most points at the World Junior Championship this year. So, I mean, if you have both of those guys, down the middle there in Buffalo, or even, if Reinhart could be a winger, perhaps. I mean, they have some goal scorers in Buffalo, and everyone's favorite all-star from this year is Zemgus Girgensson. How quickly we forget about him. This is going to be. I mean, Buffalo has a lot of needs, but it's interesting that it's become such a big thing with the tanking, where it's almost like Buffalo and Arizona are actually in it to get one of those top two picks. Where you look at Arizona's trade with Yandel and Vermette and all of their impending free agents they've offloaded. It's almost a fascinating side story to the playoff race.
Absolutely, it's like the exact opposite of a playoff race. But the fact that the NHL has changed the situation with the draft for next year, where the top 3 spots are up for grabs, I think that's a good thing, because it makes it where tanking even does less, because you could finish out of the top 3 instead of Buffalo can only finish second here, where I think it gives more teams a chance. Put it this way: if you're going to go out and field a terrible team for years at a time and trade away all your NHL prospects just to try to get draft picks and try to go that way, why should you be rewarded more than a team that just missed the playoffs that could all of a sudden be a top 3 team in their conference if they get a guy like a McDavid?
Yeah.
So in a sense, I think that it works both ways, and that's why it's important to try to do anything possible to not let it become a situation where the same teams, Edmonton Oilers, are picking at the bottom over and over again and not getting any better and wasting talent because they can't seem to put it together.
It also was interesting. I read a thing from Travis Yost this week, and I don't know if you've read it, Dave, but there was an interesting kind of idea here where kind of blow up the draft, kind of just eliminate the draft and therefore eliminate the lottery. You get to sign anybody coming out, but it's got to be in a salary cap scope again. So if you want to say hypothetically, the regular season ends, July 1st hits, and all of those guys, McDavid, Eichel, or assuming Eichel declares, because Eichel is draft eligible, he will be drafted, but he may stay in school. I read that yesterday too, that there's still concerns that Eichel could go back to school, back to Boston University next year. Obviously, if BU wins it all, that would seem less likely. But you blow up the whole draft. You say you can sign these guys, or obviously college players, it would be a little bit tougher, I imagine, because with college players you're drafting rights as opposed to drafting players. So there are a lot of players in the Frozen Four drafted. You see guys signing entry-level contracts. The Blackhawks signed a couple guys last week signing entry-level contracts who are done with their college season, either undrafted or guys who are drafted. But you blow up the draft. You say, McDavid, Eichel, you guys are free agents. You can sign with whoever you want for whatever you want. And that way you kind of deter teams who are cap spent, to the limit cap spenders, because they don't have the cap space to sign a guy like McDavid. And then you also get, it's a more fair system for the McDavid Eichel types, and those guys would get bigger deals in the front end because while they're young and in their prime. So it was an interesting way to think about it from Travis Jost. I would recommend people read that. Mm-hmm. But I wonder what your thought is on that. I mean, it doesn't seem likely, but it sounds like...
That scares me, though, because do you have people who are about the money or about winning? Look, Florida, Arizona, they're going to have a lot of cap room. The Devils have some cap room and more coming up the next couple of years. Are kids going to want to go there and play in a market where the team isn't good and there's not a lot of fans there? Well, or are they going to take less money at first to go to a team like Chicago or LA where they know they're going to be part of a good team and say, oh yeah, I'll take less for the first 2 years just to be on your team. And when I put up 60 points 2 years in a row, of course you're going to pay me big money after that. And I wonder if it's going to create a system of haves and have-nots, that you have, the original 6 teams and then the other high market teams out there getting all these players, and the next thing you know, the smaller market teams, even with cap room, are not able to sign these guys.
Yeah, no, I can see that, but it's almost where it's gone to now when you look at the teams that spend to the cap versus the teams that spend to the cap floor or only slightly above. You see the same names and same faces over and over and over again, and other than maybe a Calgary this year or a Florida this year or Washington gets in. I mean, Washington's even a big market still. And you look at Edmonton's, you said, had all those draft years, and it hasn't panned out. So, I'm not saying I agree with it. It's just a different way of looking at things. Mm-hmm. But, it's always fun to look at different ways of doing things.
And that's what we like to do here, Pat, and we're going to have a lot of different opinions as we get to the playoffs. We'll be back next week. We're going to be doing a playoff preview show. We're going to have picks. We might even have a couple really awesome guests on. Pat, I can't wait for the playoffs. I know you're excited as well.
Dave,
before we go, though, is there one game in the next few days that really stands out as something that you want to take a gander at?
I would like to watch every game Monday night, first off. But besides that, I'm going to look at Thursday because we have a potential couple of playoff previews coming up. We have Caps Canadiens. We have Lightning and Senators, which is a huge game mostly for the Senators. You get the Red Wings hosting the Bruins, both teams desperate there, and then Calgary is in St. Louis, by the way. The Rangers are in Minnesota in a potential Cup preview, and then, as you said before, Vancouver in Chicago, and cap the night with the Oilers in LA. LA needs points, and the Oilers have been a little bit tougher to play against. I think I might be watching all of those games Thursday night. Dave, what about you?
I'm going to go with an interesting one here. I'm going to go with two. First one I'm going to go with is Sunday, April 5th, Montreal at Florida. Would love to see how the penalties are decided in that game. But something a little bit more closer to right now, I'm going to go with Florida-Boston. Why? Because if Florida loses that game, again, another Florida, but if Florida loses that game, I think they're done. There'd almost be no way for them to catch Boston. If they win that game at Boston, they do get to play them again, and you never know. It would be interesting at least to have these playoff races go down to the end, and if Florida wins in Boston on Tuesday night, they'll be right back in the thick of it.
Yeah, for sure. That's, like you said, the first of two in hand, and they're going to have to win both of those because they're not two in hand, but they play two head-to-heads. They're basically going to have to win both of those to have a chance still to make the playoffs. But we're going to keep an eye on all of them, basically, this whole thing, right up to the end. For Dave Turner, I'm Pat Pickens. This has been another edition of Puck Talk with Pickens and Turner. First, big thanks to AOL Sports for hosting us, and we will get back with you next week.